Hey guys, it's Chelsea from Little Mountain Ranch, and today we're going to be doing a huge autumn harvest in our garden. I have been looking forward to doing this harvest for weeks now, and I had expected that we would have it already done by now because normally we'll get a frost here in the interior of British Columbia by the end of August, at least a light frost, and by now, by mid-September, we normally have had a fairly hard frost and everything is harvested out of the garden for the most part, except for the really hardier plants and some of the root vegetables. However, this year has been unusual and we have had really warm temperatures, but I've been watching the temperatures, the evening temperatures and night temperatures really closely, and I noticed that within the next couple of days things are supposed to be dropping down into the 4 degrees Celsius range, which is where we usually start seeing frost. And on top of that, we also have more rain in the forecast, another week's worth of rain, and we've had rain for a week already, which makes harvesting kind of a wet, cold job. And so I decided we'd get ahead of this next spell of rain and get in here and harvest as many of the squashes, the pumpkins, the potatoes, and the cabbages, and maybe a few other things as we can. You can see the kids up here in the garden. They are getting really excited about doing this harvest. They've been looking forward to it too. The squash harvest is the favorite harvest for the kids of the entire year. As we go through this harvest, I'm going to give you as many tips as I can about growing squash and then storing squash, and I'll show you how I'm storing squash this year. Before we get into the harvesting, I have a gardening confession to make. Come over here with me and I will show you what I'm talking about. For the last couple of months, I've been talking about how I've been growing collard greens for the first time ever, and how I'm using the collard greens and how beautiful the plant is. I've shown this on YouTube and I've also shown this on Instagram. This gorgeous plant here that's going all the way along, all the way to back here, I have been calling this collard greens for months now, and no one has corrected me. And then the other day I was scrolling through Instagram and I came across a picture of collard greens and I was like, that is really strange because that's not what collard greens look like. So it turns out that this is in fact a new kind of kale I decided to plant this year. Forgot that I planted it. It's beautiful and it's huge. Like you can see Oliver and Diego back there. This kale is just about over their heads. It's a beautiful kale. It's a delicious kale. I've been eating it all summer thinking it was collard greens. But in fact, when I was doing an Instagram story the other day, I was talking about how I have these cabbages, these giant, massive cabbages. For those of you that do know what collard greens is, you're gonna know where this is going. So I had these giant cabbages, but they weren't forming cabbage heads, and I was like, that's really weird. Well, I'll have to figure out what variety that is and not plant it again next year because it's taking too long to grow. So it turns out, my friends, that my beautiful giant cabbages are in fact collard greens. So for anybody that does know collard greens, you know that this is collard greens and not a cabbage, but I did not, having never grown them before, and obviously didn't pay as much attention to the packaging or labeling when I planted all my seeds and started all my seeds back in March, because if I had, I would have known that this was collard greens and not cabbage. Now, to be fair, it does look like a giant cabbage, and the collard greens and cabbages are related. So I feel like the mistake is probably okay and probably can be forgiven. I hope it can be forgiven. So needless to say, I've been growing collard greens all summer, copious amounts of collard greens. There's a beautiful one back there, another gorgeous one here, this one back here, and then several more over back here. So I will be harvesting these collard greens and blanching a whole bunch of them and freezing them for winter, along with all of these other beautiful kales that I have and those gorgeous giant kales up over there. Now that I've made my gardening confession, I feel much better now. I am going to call the kids back down to the garden and we're going to start harvesting all of these squash. All of the squash vines, because everything's been touched with a little bit of powdery mildew, will be moving out of the garden space and being burned because, like I mentioned in my last video, the spores do survive over the winter. And if I was to make compost out of this and then use it on my garden, especially in areas with squash, then I could reinfest my garden with powdery mildew. So we are gonna get on all of these squash first because they're the ones that are infested with the powdery mildew the worst. And they are spaghetti squash, and spaghetti squash do tend to be more susceptible. So that's something to keep in mind when you're planting squash. When you're harvesting squash, you wanna leave some stem on it. When this stem shrivels up and dries completely, that's when you know your squash is cured, and I'll show you how to cure squash in a minute. If you can't break them off without... Oh, perfect. Good. That's perfect. Awesome. Okay.
Whoa, this leaves moldy.
So we're gonna stack all the like squash in one spot, okay?
This is my baby.
This is one of the squash I'm so excited about. This is a butternut squash, and they take a long time to ripen, but because of our extended season, it looks like we're actually gonna get some, which is very exciting. So I'm gonna leave these vines for as long as I possibly can in hopes that these will grow a little bit bigger and ripen before the frost comes by the end of the week. What did you find there, mister?
Blue pumpkin. Bluey gray pumpkin.
Do you remember what that one's called?
Queensland Blue.
That's right, just make sure you don't break it off too low, okay?
I know. Oh, there's another one.
Pardon me? No, honey.
Just like that. Look at what I found. Oh.
That's a beautiful pumpkin.
Actually, I found that. Haha!
You did it.
Gotta turn it the other way. Like go backwards.
Get it off! Whoa! Mom, there's this weird fight!
Okay, everybody head over and grab pumpkins or grab squash and bring them over.
Just like light. You should probably lift this. Found one. Are these for carving?
No, those are for eating.
Well, what about these ones? Well, all we
Oh, there's another bright orange one.
Oh, that's all you actually did.
I know. It's bound to happen with some of them. Okay guys, we have finished the squash harvest, or at least the ones that we were able to harvest today. We did 137 squash and then a couple of giant pumpkins that you can see here. We still have a couple of giant pumpkins left. These are Dill's Atlantic Giants, and probably about 50 squash left that I'm just going to push to the very, very end, hoping that they're going to grow a little bit bigger. They're my butternut squash. There's a couple of butternut squash, or quite a few, probably 30 butternut squash, and then some miscellaneous squash that weren't quite ready yet. So I'm going to give you an overview of all of the squash here, and as I pan over, I'll put the names of each of the squashes. I have tried most of these squashes, but there's a couple of them that are new to me, so I'll report back a little later on in the season and let you know how they do as far as storageability and flavor. We ended up getting somewhere probably around 100 pounds of potatoes. Look at how gorgeous and huge this potato looks. We did end up with a couple of really strange tomatoes. You want me to make a bow? Not tomatoes, potatoes. We ended up with a couple of really strange ones.
Hey, Quinn, bring this
But for the most part, they were nice looking like that. Next year will be a little bit more of a focus on potatoes. I put most of my attention into other areas of the garden, particularly the forest garden this year, and not so much into potatoes. There you go. So here are a couple of the really weird potatoes we ended up with. But most of our potatoes were very beautiful and huge. This is the largest of all of the potatoes. The rest of them are fairly average size, but we ended up with a couple of monsters like this, but they're in really great shape. They didn't end up with scab on them. Scab is, it looks like basically a scab on the potato. I'm going to be curing the majority of these squash outside, and basically what that means, so this one is a spaghetti squash, and what I'm looking for is for the stem to completely dry out. One of the other things that you can do with your squash, although I never have, is to rub the outside of them with some type of vegetable oil or else a bit of a bleach. I am going to actually do that this year only because I've noticed a bit more mold action happening on my squashes, I think due to the extra moisture that we've had this year. So I will be doing that. And when I put all of these squash up into the pantry in the house and I do my big pantry tour, then I'll give a little bit more information about storage in there. But what we're going to do now is we're going to move all of these squash up to underneath the deck so that they're covered and they're out of the rain. And besides the fact that it will have this completely dried off, as you won't be able to stick your fingernail in it, and this is for winter squash, of course, you won't be able to dent it with your fingernail. That's when you know that it is ready to go into your storage. So that's the next stage of what we're going to do now. I just wanted to give you a couple of tips for growing squash that I've learned over the last couple of years. One of the biggest things that I can tell you about squash is that they're really heavy feeders. They need to be grown in really rich soil, preferably a really, really good compost. You can just about grow them in straight compost. You've probably seen pictures on Instagram or elsewhere, heard stories of squash coming up in the compost pile. They really, really love that rich soil. So that's number one. One of the other things about squash is they like to have a lot of water. They don't like to dry out. You'll notice that the leaves will start drooping pretty quickly if they start drying out. It's really normal for the leaves to droop in the hot of the midday sun, but they'll usually perk back up. But they don't like to dry out, so make sure that you keep them wet. If you do notice that your plants just aren't looking super perky halfway through the season, you can give them a little bit of an extra feed, either with an organic fertilizer or with some extra compost. Okay, we are all going to pitch in together and get all of these squash moved up under the house. We are going to put the potatoes right into the pantry. Normally I would let them dry out a little bit, but we actually forgot the last box outside under the deck and ended up losing all the ones on the top because they turned green. If you leave potatoes out in the light for too long, they will turn green, and you can't eat that green flesh. It'll give you a really bad stomach ache. So I'm going to just avoid that altogether and go and put these into my pantry right away. Starting to rain, so thankfully we're just about done. We're gonna bring them up. Come on, hold my hand, honey. Hold my hand. You sure you don't want me to carry those? No? We're gonna bring them up and put them underneath the covered porch and let them cure there. One of the things I don't want is my chickens to get near them and start pecking holes in them. My chickens have been trapped in their run and haven't been able to free range for the last couple of months because they like to get in my garden and peck holes in my squashes, but they're gonna be able to be let out now that most of the squashes are up here. So I have a confession to make. I didn't really want to plant a garden this past spring. There were a lot of things that were going on in my life at the time that were just sort of taking up all my headspace, and I didn't feel like I had the space left to plant a garden and manage a garden all summer long. But Dan came to me and he said, you love gardening so much, and if you don't plant a garden, you are going to regret it. So I really encourage you to plant a garden, even though you don't feel like it now, because come harvest time, you're gonna feel so good about it. So I just wanna thank my husband for knowing me well, because I am so grateful that we have this wonderful harvest to be able to put up in our pantry, and I can feed my kids really good, healthy, organic food that we all worked together to grow. You can hear the rain probably up above me here. So on that note, we're gonna head inside. I'm actually gonna light a fire in the wood stove because it's a little bit chilly in the house right now. And the kids are going to play some video games, watch some movies. I'm going to get some dinner on. I'm making lasagna tonight because my eldest son is going to be coming over for dinner tonight. He's requested lasagna and salad, so that's what I'm gonna be making for dinner tonight, and I need to get in there and do that. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I'll see you again soon, guys. Bye.